What if everything you were taught to revere was built upon sand? What if the very ground upon which billions place their hopes, their morals, their entire understanding of existence was never solid to begin with? Consider this. You have been told since childhood that certain truths are unquestionable, that certain figures walked this earth and changed its course, that certain lands are holy by divine decree. But who told you this? And more importantly, why did you believe them without demanding proof? I ask you now with the same unflinching clarity that Baruch Spinoza employed when he dared to question the unquestionable. What is the difference between a deeply held belief and a carefully constructed illusion? Is it possible that millions can be wrong? Is it conceivable that the foundations of Western civilization rest upon narratives that cannot withstand the light of rational inquiry? You may feel uncomfortable right now. Good. Discomfort is the first sign that your mind is awakening from its dogmatic slumber. For centuries, humanity has been conditioned to accept without examination, to believe without evidence, to surrender reason at the altar of tradition. But what happens when we refuse? What happens when we apply the same rigorous standards to religious claims that we apply to every other aspect of our lives? Spinoza understood something that most people spend their entire lives avoiding: that true freedom begins not with belief, but with doubt. Not the doubt of cynicism or despair, but the doubt of honest inquiry. The doubt that asks, show me the evidence, convince my reason, not just my emotions. Today, we will embark on a journey that will challenge everything you thought you knew about one of history's most influential figures and the land declared sacred by billions. We will examine claims with the cold precision of logic. We will ask questions that are forbidden in polite company. We will follow the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of how many cherished beliefs must fall along the way. The question before us is not whether you will be offended. The question is whether you have the courage to think. Let us begin with a simple observation. Every culture throughout history has created myths to explain its origins, to justify its values, to unite its people under a common narrative. The Greeks had their pantheon, the Romans had theirs. The Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Norse peoples all constructed elaborate stories of gods and heroes who shaped the world. Today we recognize these as mythology. We study them as fascinating windows into ancient minds, but we do not mistake them for historical fact. Why then do we treat the narratives of one particular culture differently? What makes the stories of ancient Judea exempt from the same scrutiny we apply to stories from ancient Greece or Rome? Is it because they are older? They are not. Is it because they are more coherently documented? They are not. Is it because they align better with archaeological evidence? As we shall see, they demonstrably do not. The answer, if we are honest, is simply this. We were born into a civilization that chose these particular stories as foundational. We inherited them. We were taught them before we developed the capacity for critical thought. And by the time we gained that capacity, the stories had already woven themselves into the fabric of our identity. Spinoza recognized this mechanism with remarkable clarity. In his groundbreaking work, the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, he did what no one before him had dared to do. He analyzed religious texts the same way one would analyze any other historical document. He asked basic questions. He demanded consistency. He looked for corroborating evidence. And what he found troubled him deeply. He found contradictions that could not be reconciled. He found historical claims that were demonstrably false. He found moral teachings that reflected the prejudices and tribal interests of their time, rather than any eternal wisdom. Most disturbingly, he found that the very texts proclaimed as divine revelation showed clear signs of human authorship, human editing, human political motivation. But here is where the story becomes truly fascinating. Spinoza was not trying to destroy faith. He was trying to liberate it. He was trying to separate genuine spiritual insight from the accumulated superstitions and power structures that had attached themselves to it like barnacles on a ship. He believed that God, properly understood, was not the tribal deity described in ancient texts, but rather the infinite substance of reality itself, the natural order that operates according to rational principles. This is why he was excommunicated, not because he denied God, but because he refused to accept the God of tribal mythology. Not because he rejected spiritual truth, but because he insisted that truth must be discovered through reason rather than inherited through tradition. Now let us turn our attention to the specific case before us, the historical existence of Jesus of Nazareth and the supposed sanctity of the land called Palestine. You might say, but surely Jesus existed. The evidence is overwhelming. Is it? Let us examine this claim with the same skepticism we would apply to any other historical figure from antiquity. What do we actually have? We have no contemporary accounts, not one. Every text that mentions Jesus was written decades after his supposed death by people who never met him. We have no Roman records of his trial, despite the Romans being meticulous record keepers who documented far less significant events. We have no archaeological evidence of his existence, no artifacts that can be definitively linked to him, no mention of him in the extensive writings of contemporary Jewish historians like Philo of Alexandria, who wrote prolifically about religious figures of his time. What we have are stories. Stories written by believers, for believers, in a language Jesus did not speak, Greek, describing events in Palestine that the writers themselves had never witnessed. Stories that contradict each other on basic facts: where he was born, when he was born, what he said, what he did, how he died, who witnessed his death, who witnessed his supposed resurrection. Think about this carefully. If a modern court of law were presented with such evidence to establish the existence of any other historical figure, it would be dismissed as hearsay. The standards of evidence we accept for Jesus are standards we would never accept for anyone else. Why? Because we want to believe, because the alternative is unsettling. But facts do not care about our comfort. Reality does not bend to our desires. Either a person existed or they did not. Either the evidence supports the claim or it does not. And when we examine the evidence without the lens of faith, without the weight of tradition, without the fear of social consequence, what remains is remarkably thin. The earliest Christian texts, the letters of Paul, are revealing in what they do not say. Paul never quotes Jesus' teachings. He never describes Jesus' life on earth. He never mentions Mary or Joseph. He never references any of the stories that would later appear in the Gospels. For Paul, Jesus is a cosmic figure who was crucified and resurrected, but there is no indication that Paul understood this as a recent historical event. It reads more like the mystery religions of the time, where dying and rising gods were spiritual symbols rather than historical persons. The Gospels themselves, written between 40 and 70 years after the supposed events, show clear signs of mythological development. The earliest Gospel, Mark, is the simplest. Jesus is a human teacher and healer. By the time we get to John, the last Gospel written, Jesus has become a cosmic being who existed before the creation of the world. This is not how history works. This is how mythology develops. Each retelling adds more supernatural elements, more divine attributes, more miraculous claims. Moreover, the Gospels are filled with historical impossibilities. They describe a census that never happened, conducted in a manner that no Roman census was ever conducted. They describe a massacre of children that no historian of the time recorded, in a region where such an event would certainly have been documented. They describe darkness covering the earth for 3 hours, an astronomical impossibility that would have been noted by every civilization on the planet, yet appears in no astronomical records from any culture. Are we to believe that the sun stopped shining for 3 hours and nobody except Christian writers noticed? But let us assume, for the sake of argument, that some historical person existed upon whom these stories are loosely based. A Jewish teacher, a charismatic preacher, perhaps even someone who ran afoul of Roman authority. Does this validate the supernatural claims? Does this make the land where he supposedly walked sacred? Here we arrive at an even deeper problem, the concept of sacred geography itself. What does it mean to call a piece of land holy? Does the earth beneath Jerusalem contain different atoms than the earth beneath Paris or Beijing? Do the laws of physics operate differently there? Of course not. The sacredness of a place exists only in the minds of those who believe in it. It is a projection, a collective agreement to treat one location as special because events that may or may not have happened supposedly occurred there. And what events are these? According to tradition, this land was promised by God to a particular people. But which God? The tribal deity of a Bronze Age nomadic people? A deity who commanded genocide against neighboring tribes? Who demanded animal sacrifice? Who was, according to the texts themselves, jealous, wrathful, and deeply concerned with the minutiae of dietary laws and fabric blending? Is this the eternal, infinite, perfect God that philosophical theology describes? Or is this simply what you would expect ancient people to imagine, a deity who shares their prejudices, validates their tribal identity, and sanctions their conquest of neighboring lands? The archaeological evidence is devastating to the traditional narrative. There is no evidence for a mass exodus from Egypt. There is no evidence for 40 years of wandering in the desert by hundreds of thousands of people. There is no evidence for the conquest of Canaan as described in the book of Joshua. What we find instead is evidence of continuous Canaanite habitation, with the Israelites emerging gradually from within Canaan itself rather than conquering it from outside. In other words, the foundational narrative upon which the concept of the Holy Land rests, the promise of God to Abraham, the exodus from Egypt, the conquest of the Promised Land, has no historical basis. It is national mythology, powerful mythology certainly, influential mythology that has shaped civilizations. But mythology nonetheless. This is not a small problem. This is not a minor discrepancy. This undermines the entire conceptual framework upon which claims to divine favor and sacred territory rest. If the Exodus did not happen, then the covenant at Sinai did not happen. If the covenant did not happen, then the promised land is not promised. If the land is not divinely promised, then its sanctity is purely a human construction, a belief maintained by those who benefit from its maintenance. Think about what this means. Think about the conflicts, the bloodshed, the centuries of war fought over a piece of territory whose sacredness exists only because people agreed it was sacred. Think about the lives lost, the families destroyed, the hatred perpetuated, all in defense of claims that cannot withstand rational scrutiny. Spinoza saw this clearly. He saw how religious narratives were used to justify political power, to unite people against outsiders, to claim divine authorization for very human ambitions. He saw that Scripture, rather than being the eternal Word of God, was the product of specific historical circumstances, written by people with specific agendas, edited and compiled by religious authorities to serve specific institutional needs. This does not make these texts worthless. They contain wisdom. They reflect genuine spiritual insight. They are valuable as literature, as history, as windows into the human search for meaning. But they are not what they claim to be. They are not divine revelation. They are human documents, fallible and contradictory, products of their time and place. And once we recognize this, once we see religious texts for what they actually are, rather than what tradition tells us they are, everything changes. We are no longer bound by ancient tribal laws. We are no longer required to believe impossible things. We are no longer obligated to treat one piece of land as more sacred than another. We are free to seek truth wherever it leads. We are free to construct our ethics based on reason and compassion rather than the commands of a Bronze Age deity. We are free to recognize the divine not in ancient myths, but in the extraordinary order and beauty of the natural world itself. This is what Spinoza understood. This is what got him expelled from his community. This is what makes his thought still dangerous, still radical, still necessary more than 3 centuries after his death. He refused to accept comfortable lies. He refused to pretend that tradition equals truth. He refused to treat his inherited beliefs as immune from rational examination, and this refusal cost him everything. He was excommunicated at age 23. His own family was forbidden to speak with him. He lived in poverty, supporting himself by grinding lenses, his eyes slowly deteriorating from the fine dust. He died young, at age 44, alone and virtually friendless. His books were banned. His ideas were condemned by Jews, Catholics, and Protestants alike. Why such fury? Why such fear? Because he had exposed the mechanism by which religious authority maintains itself, through the claim that certain texts, certain places, certain beliefs are beyond question. Once you question them, once you subject them to rational analysis, the entire structure begins to crumble. Not because faith is inherently unreasonable, but because institutional religion has built itself on claims that cannot survive scrutiny. The church understood this instinctively. The synagogue understood this. They knew that if people started thinking for themselves, started demanding evidence, started treating religious claims with the same skepticism they applied to other areas of life, belief would no longer be automatic. It would have to be earned. And many of the traditional claims could not be earned because they were never true in the first place. But here is what makes this moment, your reading of these words right now, so significant. You live in a time of unprecedented access to information. The scholarship that was once locked away in university libraries is now available to anyone with an internet connection. The archaeological evidence, the historical analysis, the textual criticism that once took years of specialized study to access can now be examined by anyone willing to look. You no longer have to take my word for it. You no longer have to take anyone's word for it. You can look at the evidence yourself. You can read what secular historians and archaeologists have discovered. You can examine the contradictions in the texts. You can see for yourself that the traditional narrative does not hold up under examination. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Once you recognize that these are human stories, not divine revelations, everything shifts. The question is no longer, what must I believe, but rather, what can I demonstrate to be true? The question is no longer, what does Scripture command, but rather, what does reason and compassion suggest? The question is no longer, which piece of land is holy, but rather, how can we share this earth peacefully? This is liberation. This is what Spinoza was offering. Not the destruction of spirituality, but its purification. Not the rejection of the divine, but a more coherent understanding of it. Not nihilism, but a foundation for ethics that does not depend on ancient myths or tribal loyalties. So where does this leave us? If Jesus may not have existed as a historical person, if the Holy Land is holy only because people believe it is, if the foundational narratives of Western religion are mythology rather than history, what remains? Everything and nothing. Nothing remains of the comforting certainties that make people feel special, chosen, uniquely favored by the Creator of the universe. Nothing remains of the divine authorization for tribal identity and territorial claims. Nothing remains of the easy answers that religious tradition provides to life's deepest questions. But everything remains that actually matters. The universe in all its incomprehensible vastness still exists. The laws of nature, elegant and impersonal, still govern the motions of galaxies and the interactions of particles. Human consciousness, that inexplicable capacity for thought and feeling and wonder, still illuminates the cosmos from within. The moral challenge of how to live well, how to treat others, how to create meaning in a universe that offers no obvious purpose, still confronts each of us. These challenges do not become easier when we abandon comforting myths. In some ways, they become harder. It is easier to follow ancient commands than to reason through ethical dilemmas yourself. It is easier to believe you are part of God's chosen people than to recognize your common humanity with all people everywhere. It is easier to pray for intervention than to accept responsibility for solving your own problems. But difficulty is not a reason to avoid truth. The fact that reality is harder to face than illusion does not make illusion preferable. The mature mind, a free mind, accepts the world as it is rather than as we wish it were. Spinoza wrote, "I have made a ceaseless effort not to ridicule, not to bewail, not to scorn human actions, but to understand them." This is the key. We do not reject religious narratives out of contempt for those who believe them. We examine them to understand how they arose, what purposes they served, why they endure. We recognize that humans need stories, need meaning, need community. Religious traditions provided these things for millennia, but we have evolved. Our understanding of the world has expanded exponentially. We know the Earth orbits the Sun. We know species evolved through natural selection. We know diseases are caused by microorganisms, not divine punishment. We know the universe is billions of years old, not thousands. We know the claims of ancient texts about the natural world are, quite simply, wrong. Why then do we continue to treat their claims about the supernatural world, about God, about the soul, about sacred history as if they have special authority? Is it not more likely that these claims are equally products of their time, equally limited by the understanding available to their authors? This is not arrogance, this is not claiming to know everything. It is simply acknowledging that we know more now than ancient people did, and that our beliefs should reflect our best current understanding rather than the understanding of people who knew nothing of biology, physics, astronomy, psychology, or history as we understand them today. The sacred, if it exists, does not depend on ancient texts being historically accurate. The divine, properly understood, is not threatened by archaeological evidence or textual criticism. Truth, by definition, can withstand scrutiny. Only falsehood requires protection from examination. So I ask you again, what are you afraid of? If your beliefs are true, then evidence will support them. If they are not, then do you really want to continue believing false things simply because they are comfortable? Is that honest? Is that consistent with the value you supposedly place on truth? Spinoza paid an enormous price for his honesty. He sacrificed community, family, financial security, even his health, because he refused to pretend he believed what he did not believe. He refused to mouth the words of faith when his reason told him they were false. He refused to participate in the collective lie, even when continuing the lie would have made his life immeasurably easier. This is the challenge before you now, not whether to believe in God, that is a separate question, but whether to be honest about the evidence, whether to acknowledge that the historical and archaeological record does not support the traditional narratives, whether to admit that the claims about Jesus and the Holy Land, claims that billions accept without examination, cannot withstand rational scrutiny. You can choose comfort. You can choose to continue believing what you have always believed, to avoid the unsettling questions, to maintain your place in your community. No one can force you to confront uncomfortable truths. The mind has remarkable capacity for avoiding what it does not wish to see. Or you can choose freedom, the freedom to think for yourself, the freedom to base your beliefs on evidence rather than tradition, the freedom to construct your own understanding of the world rather than accepting the understanding handed down to you, the freedom to be wrong, to change your mind, to follow truth wherever it leads. This freedom is terrifying. It offers no guarantees. It provides no cosmic safety net. It demands that you take responsibility for your own beliefs, your own values, your own meaning. It strips away the comforting feeling that someone, somewhere, has all the answers and will take care of you if you just believe and obey. But it is the only freedom worth having. All other freedoms are meaningless if you are not free in your own mind. Understanding is not the same as believing. This is perhaps the most important distinction Spinoza taught us. You can understand why people believe something. You can understand the psychological and social functions that belief serves without believing it yourself. You can appreciate the beauty of religious poetry, the power of ritual, the wisdom contained in ethical teachings, without accepting the supernatural claims attached to them. Many people never grasp this distinction. They think that to question their beliefs is to lose everything. They equate doubt with despair. They cannot imagine finding meaning or purpose without the framework they were given. But meaning does not come from outside. It never did. The meaning you found in religious narratives was always meaning you brought to them, meaning you constructed using those narratives as raw material. The capacity for meaning-making is in you, not in the texts. The texts are just catalysts, just tools. And if they are flawed tools, based on claims that are not true, then you can use better tools. You can find meaning in understanding how the cosmos actually works, in all its staggering complexity. You can find purpose in alleviating suffering, in increasing knowledge, in creating beauty, in loving others. You can find community with those who share your values, rather than those who share your inherited beliefs. You can build an ethical framework based on the consequences of your actions, rather than ancient commands whose origins and contexts are lost to history. This is not a diminishment of human existence, it is an enhancement. It places the responsibility for creating a good life exactly where it belongs. With you. Not with ancient authorities who claimed to speak for God. Not with religious institutions that claim to mediate between you and the divine. With you, the free individual, using your reason and your compassion to navigate an uncertain world. Spinoza died believing he had failed. His books were banned. His ideas were condemned. The world seemed to reject everything he had worked for. But ideas have a life of their own. They spread slowly, often underground, sometimes taking centuries to bear fruit. The enlightenment that followed Spinoza owed an enormous debt to his thought. The scientific revolution, the gradual separation of church and state, the recognition of individual rights, the application of rational analysis to all claims, including religious claims, all of this followed paths that Spinoza had first cleared. You are inheriting that tradition now. You are the beneficiary of centuries of people who chose truth over comfort, who valued understanding over belief, who had the courage to question what their cultures told them was unquestionable. You have access to knowledge that would have seemed miraculous to Spinoza. You can see further than he could. You can understand more than he could. But you face the same choice he faced, whether to use that knowledge honestly or whether to compartmentalize it, to apply rational standards to some areas of life while leaving others protected behind walls of faith. Whether to be fully awake or to sleepwalk through the most important questions of existence. There is a moment in every thinking person's life when they realize they have been lied to, not maliciously perhaps, not intentionally, but lied to nonetheless. They realize that the stories they were told as children, the beliefs they were taught to accept without question, do not correspond to reality as they now understand it. This moment is painful. It feels like betrayal. It shakes the foundations of identity. But it is also the moment when real thought becomes possible. It is the moment when you stop being a passive recipient of inherited belief and become an active seeker of truth. It is the moment when your life becomes truly yours. This is that moment. The historical Jesus, if he existed at all, was not the divine savior of traditional Christianity. The Holy Land is not holy. The Exodus did not happen. The covenant was not made. The scriptures are not divine revelation. These are human stories, valuable as human stories, instructive as human stories, but not what they claim to be. You know this now. You may have suspected it before. You may have pushed the thought away, afraid of where it would lead. But now you know. The evidence is clear. The traditional narrative cannot be maintained by anyone who examines it honestly. So what will you do with this knowledge? Will you join the conversation, the grand human conversation about what is true, what is good, what is possible? Will you share your thoughts, your doubts, your questions? Will you help others navigate this difficult territory? The comment section below is not just a place for reactions. It is a space for genuine dialogue, for testing ideas, for thinking together. And will you continue this exploration? This is not the end of the inquiry. There are libraries of scholarship waiting to be discovered. There are questions upon questions, each leading deeper into understanding. Subscribe not because you agree with everything presented here, but because you value the process of honest investigation. Because you want to continue the conversation that Spinoza began more than 300 years ago. The truth Spinoza knew will not make you comfortable, but it will make you free. And freedom, difficult and uncertain as it may be, is worth more than all the comforting illusions ever constructed by human fear and human hope. Think, question, seek, understand. The rest is commentary.